This is Henk Akkermans and this is Smart Asset Management Lecture 3. Section 4, Organizational Complexity of Lifecycle Costing. So far we already saw that there are technical and financial complexity in lifecycle costing. And now we look at what brings it all together, the organizational complexity of it. And we do so based on a single article by Jim Lyneis and Sterman, How to Save a Leaky Ship. It's a great article because it combines many things. The case setting is really cool. It's the campus of MIT and all the infrastructure needed to run that campus over here. I've had the pleasure of being there over the years many times, starting in 1992, I think, when I first did a summer school there. So you've got this great case. The literature summary is really excellent, and I will spend considerable time on that as well. The model that they make on the basis of their empirical research is pretty elegant, and the implications are important for our course. So let's start with the literature. Well, the literature on life cycle costing for what we have here in the case, which is investments to make buildings, etc., more energy efficient, which often means having more proactive maintenance on them. That literature is really positive about doing that. They call it win-win actions, and it's also on greenhouse gases, on energy use in general, on pollution. They often yield positive net present value values and short payback times. And indeed, beyond that, when you are the first on the block to invest on this, you can anticipate future regulations on emission or energy efficiency before it becomes regulatory, and therefore have a head start with the competition. You can build a relationship with important stakeholders, strengthen your reputation, and yet, despite widespread evidence documenting win-win investments, organizations often fail to make them, and that's where the article starts. Now, there is in various disciplines quite some, but not all, a theory on why this is. There's organizational theory and there's economical theory. The organizational theory is actually, as Lyneis and Sterman say, largely silent on the question, because there it's often seen in the context of shareholders versus other stakeholders, so the firm to its environment, and not really if something is good for the firm itself, why wouldn't they do it? The economists, they it's a varied bunch. There is a whole group of them that simply says, well, if those were win-win investments, companies would make them, and because they don't make them, they are not win-win investments. That sounds like the kind of reasoning you hear more and more outside of research, but still, that's what they say. Many others say no, it's not. There are cases where there is underinvestment, but that's market failures, and market failures is actually what the majority of the economy is about. It seems sometimes. There's also a problem of asymmetric information, so that means that companies may not have the information they need upfront to explain why it's a good idea to invest. And there are certainly also principal-agent interactions. So if you as a tenant pay rent, which includes stuff for maintenance on your apartment, then your landlord they gets the money for the maintenance, but has no problem under investing in the maintenance because he or she doesn't live there. So that's a principal agent problem indeed. So but does that explain our problem? Well, there can be behavioral biases. We've talked and we will keep talking about short-term and functional biases, where managers may evaluate based on what's in it for my organization function rather than the whole, or may choose investment options that have a lower initial investment, cash investment, than later on, simply to defer the main cost to the future, or they may underweigh low probability, high consequence risk, as we'll see later on also. Well, it's a small likelihood that this will happen, and it's certain money that I have to invest now, so I do it. And they may also, of course, bow to all sorts of pressures for short-term financial results. And yet, yes, companies do that, but other companies don't. So there are many cases where the right thing is being done. So why is it then? And if it's the right thing to do for all companies, that one company does it and the other one doesn't. And here the point in the paper is that it may also have to do with the dynamics of program implementation. And that sounds a bit vague now, but it's pretty to the point, as we'll see pretty on what's further. It's not so strange that John Sterman is making that point, because he already has a background in that area of capability traps, and he's also a professor at MIT at the Sloan School of Management. So this is the point where our case is set, and MIT would be the ideal place, in fact, to make those energy efficient investments. It has a pro-social mission. It's not about making money, it's about making society a better place. It has a really long time horizon. In academia, we look at generations. It has lots of money, substantial endowment, as it's called in the article. It has a very positive credit rating. There are now shareholders, and it doesn't even have this principal agent problem, that it's because it's not only the tenant, but it's also the landlord. And nevertheless, as the case study illustrates, MIT has failed to make investments in energy saving. Another reason why it's logical that John Sterman is the author of this article and focuses the dynamic effects is because he already wrote about it some 15 years earlier. The notion of the capability trap. The capability trap, well documented in the literature, including the paper that has, for me, the best ever title. Nobody ever gets credit for fixing problems that never happened. But really it's about the capability trap, and it's often explained in terms of this guy who's chopping wood, pile of wood to be chopped to the left, and lots of wood that has been chopped to the right. But it's quite clear from an expert, and you are an expert when you look at him, that the problem is really the axe is really blunt. It should be sharpened. So you go to this guy and say, hey, I see you have all this work to do and you're doing great, but your axe is really blunt. Why don't you go out and sharpen it? And the guy chopping wood looks up at you a bit irritated and says, I don't have time to chop. I don't have time to sharpen my axe. I have all this wood to be chopped. Look at this pile. So that's the problem in this capability trap. This guy is stuck in his current capability of chopping with a blunt axe, and as a result of that, he isn't sharpening the axe. He doesn't take the time off to improve, to sharpen the axe, or improve skills in general. This is a general picture where here's an amount of work to be done, the required output. Here's the capability to realize that output. And somehow, in some point, your output falls short of what you need to do, and then you can work harder or you can work smarter. But if you work smarter, you don't work harder, and if you don't work harder, you don't work smarter. There's only so much, the total amount of time available or energy that you have is fixed. And so it means that in the short term, if you focus more on working smarter, actually you will be working harder a bit less. And this resulting feedback loop can either lead to reinvestment, so sharpen the axe and become capable of doing all the work, or to ruin if you spend less and less time on improving your capabilities and therefore get worn out, or your capabilities may decrease in one way or another, autonomously or as a result of what you're doing. In a behavior over time graph, you can see it like this. This is also it's from the current article, but basically it's about this hurdler stuff of capability traps. So suppose here that you've got the cost and here the system performance, and we start off with a steady state where the total cost for maintenance is the corrective one, the red line, plus a proactive one, not shown here. The result is the total. And what you see a little decline here, but I don't know if that's intended or not. At any rate, there's this moment that there is a one-time budget cost. That's what you like to do in simulation models, give them a test input. So there's less money available, and what you do then is that you cut in the proactive maintenance. You still have to do the reactive maintenance, but you make a cut here that becomes less. Interestingly, in the short term, things will get better because less often will equipment or infrastructure be unavailable because some preventive maintenance, some checking, some inspection or whatever, some improvement or something that's not yet broken has to be done. And you do that less often. But over time, what you see is that you end up in a death spiral or a vicious cycle effect of having to do more and more reactive maintenance. And of course, the reactive maintenance today is something that you could have presented with the proactive maintenance of yesterday with less cost and less consequences. And so performance goes down and the cost go up. And there you've got your capability trap. So this is already a known thing. And now they apply it to maintenance and energy use at MIT. Some quotes from the case. There is a group of around 100 people who are the R&M, the research and maintenance group. And they have two kinds of work. They have reactive maintenance, where they resolve breakdowns, and they have proactive maintenance, where they do scheduled preventive maintenance and inspection, etc. None of this is condition-based, but still there's reactive versus proactive, and that's already a big difference. Many of the reactive work come from people at MIT who complain it's too cold or it's too hot or there's a leaking there or the light isn't working, whatever. Well, the usual stuff. We all live in buildings. And there's, of course, an academic department as well. So they do two kinds of work, but what you find out is they do more and more of one kind of work, the corrective maintenance. And that is because there's such a huge backlog of deferred maintenance, the maintenance that should have been done and hasn't been done in the past year after year and leading to bigger and bigger problems. MIT itself identified some 7 or 8 years before the study was done that it's $1.5 billion in dollars in deferred maintenance that they're looking at for a company, for a university that has several multiples of that amount in endowment, I assume. So, and it's the usual stuff, it's the HVAC, it's steam, plumbing, it's single glazed windows, cracks in the buildings. And it's understandable because here again you have aging equipment. This equipment, and it has gone on for 2 or 3 times its original lifespan. This is a quote from one of the engineers. But yeah, they're still band-aiding them together. So, obvious that there is accumulation of deferred maintenance. It then looks that they have become caught, this group as well, in a capability trap of ineffective corrective maintenance. So 85% of all maintenance hours were spent on reporting or reacting to customer calls. 40% of those problems were urgent. They had to happen within 2 or 3 days. It can get pretty cold in the winter in Boston. It can also get pretty hot in the summer. As a result of this, the R&M personnel becomes more and more reactive and less customer, and all this great customer focus in the end undermined effectiveness. Managers can't really plan work, the quality of the work suffered, and the time to do the behind-the-scenes proactive maintenance simply wasn't there. By the way, also deferred maintenance costs energy, cracks in the wall, water damage, temperature losses, burst pipe, etc. How did they get so far? Well, it's easy to look at. That's because of the credit crisis of 2008. Well, actually, it could be, but you can also go back to the Great Depression because that's as long as MIT has been around. And yes, they do create temporary pressures. However, if you talk to the people that have been around, like this mechanic of over 30 years, they say, every year there's a budget pressure. And why? And then you get to the behavioral side, because a company or a university like MIT, although it's very well endowed, they always have a competition for scarce resources. Labs that want more equipment, departments that want bigger programs, hire more staff. People that want to aid the students. This is an expensive education. And that's very clear and tangible and in your face. And there's a thing, you know what, let's do this year a bit less on maintenance. Hey, it's been a problem for ages now. How much worse can it get in 1 year? And it's not that people deny that it needs to be done, but there is the discrepancy between something very clear and short term and something, well, long term and not so clear at all. So what Jim Lyneis and John Sterman did is they actually made a thorough analysis of all the different kinds for every building, all the different kinds of main category of equipment that can break. And they come up with a modified version of the capability traps archetype, if you like. Each one which focuses here on defects rather than on capabilities. So defects, well, we know this from our degradation model and our failure modes. Defects are mostly latent. When a pump is leaking, it will still work. When a wall is cracked, it will not collapse straight away. So, but after a while they do, and then they need to be worked at. So the overall building and system condition leads to more of aging infrastructure, leads to more defects. Defects are created, and there are two ways of taking them out. One is the reactive one. Somebody sees a problem, flags it, failures, complaints, and there's repairs. Or a proactive one where actually on the basis of what you already know in the backlog, you try and do something before it gets really bad. Now, again, here you see the working harder and the working smarter feedback loops. So basically, this is the same logic, but it worked very well up here. If you then, because this is translated into a system dynamic simulation model, if you then look at some policies, then several of the usual ones, of the obvious ones, the usual suspects, are not effective. You would say, you know what, let's spend some more money for 5 years. On more maintenance. And if you do that, that's the green policy. The black one is the business as usual, the BAU. And here you see the deferred maintenance keeps growing in the business as usual. The energy keeps growing, total defect keep growing. And the proactive maintenance fraction is almost going down to zero. In the green maintenance surge, you don't really do much on the deferred maintenance. It's marginal. There are some defects that are being corrected. Of course, nothing happens on the energy, and it's simply not enough to tilt the system to get out of the vicious cycle. Renewal, so taking out those old buildings or taking out that old equipment and replacing it, does help, of course, to get out a lot of the deferred maintenance, because if the equipment is no longer there, it's also not deferred in its maintenance. But still, the trend is still upward, and perhaps also because it's not sustained for long enough. This is also, again, for 5 years, 150 million a year, which is a lot more than the 5 million in the maintenance surge. But these would be the obvious things to do, and they just don't work well enough, because they can't flip the vicious cycle into a virtuous one. There are sustained policies that do work. And here is a bunch of them. So one is to keep at this sustained renewal for every year for 20 years in a row. And then you get to the yellowish, brownish line. And there you see that, yes, you do get things down a lot. So that's not the maintenance option, but this is asset management, but simply replacing the aged buildings. If on top of that, you also do more on maintenance, so that's the blue line, so this policy plus a substantial amount more on maintenance, then that does cost you some money, but the net cash flow is more or less positive. In itself, it doesn't really solve these fundamental problems, although all of them are going down here. But if you would then also invest in energy efficiency, so on top of that, and last but not least, put the savings from the energy efficiency, which are quite good, that's the red line up here, back into even improved savings, yes, then you've got the nicest cash flow. So you see that the best policy is one where you have the steepest investments, although investment, saving that you reinvest, well, yeah, that's an investment. But also the highest savings of the cash flow overall. So, but all of these policies have a net positive cash flow and net present value, which is what you want, and which is what the simulation analysis can reveal quite nicely. What do we see? Well, we see actually the new building E62, the Sloan School building, which was established in 2010. And it's a very energy efficient and sustainable building. And John Sterman is amongst the most, the person who should be credited most for making it happen. But what we also see in conceptually is that this is a nice example where technical issues, deferred maintenance, cracks in buildings, financial issues, competition for scarce resources, and behavioral issues, the short term versus the long term, the tangible versus the intangible, all interact dynamically. And that's what we need to do in general. We need to have this integrated and dynamic perspective on life cycle costing, else the financial calculations will simply not be translated into action.